Welcome to Real Grief, Real Healing with Mindy Corporan. I am your host, Mindy. A friend of mine told me in early 2018 that she saw a vision of me with a microphone in front of me. I laughed at the time and said, "I don't see any microphones in my future." Less than a year later, I was recording my first podcast on this show. I'm not going to say, "I hope you enjoy this podcast." My podcast is not truly meant to be enjoyed. Real grief, real healing is just that, real and raw. I provide you an opportunity to learn and share in the grief others are experiencing, and then we share how they are healing or perhaps not. Grief changes each of us in some way. Many of my guests have been encouraged to open new businesses, start foundations, and in general, work to make the world around us a better place. Grief is universal. How we decide to move onward, seeking healing, is individual. A significant part of my healing comes through the courageous kindness actions of others. As you listen to my podcasts, you will hear how you can give and receive courageous kindness too. Together, we are better.
Welcome to Real Grief, Real Healing with Mindy Corporan, taking a deep dive into the reality of the difficulty grief brings and offering insight into the healing available to each of us. Today, episode 40, Hate is Unacceptable and Proven So with Love. And now your host, Mindy Corporan.
Hi friends, it's Mindy Corporan. Thank you for joining me today on Real Grief, Real Healing with myself, Mindy Corporan. I really appreciate you being here today. Hey, in the event you are being asked to continue wearing a mask, which I think you probably are, I want you to know that you could be wearing a courageous kindness mask. On my website at www.mindycorporan.com, you can go to my shop page, and there are several little fun items there. One of which is a courageous kindness mask. So if you are collecting masks like I am and find it fun to have something unique and different every so often, please take a look at that mask and wear courageous kindness. Thank you again for joining me. Today, I have a guest whom I've known about for several years and had the pleasure of watching her and the involvement she's had with her foundation. Two for Seder is what we're going to be talking about, and we're going to be talking about Two for Seder with Marnie Fienberg. Now, this came about just like so many of my guests. This came about as a healing process for Marnie after the passing, and I shouldn't say that, I know better, after the murder of her mother-in-law, Joyce Fienberg. And I'm just going to make a clarification there for you of my listeners that, you know, in my life with Dad and Reet being murdered, I tend to never say Reet passed away or my dad passed away. I do use the term that they were murdered, and that it's important to me to say that because they didn't die of an illness or a sickness, or they had a specific violent action taken against them. And so did Joyce Fienberg. And so I want to make sure and be clear about this aspect. So Joyce Fienberg, along with 10 other humans and wonderful people, were at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on October 27th, 2018. And they lost their life to a violent murder. And it was tragic, and it is still tragic. It is still very early in the healing process for Marnie, her husband, who happens to be Joyce's son, and their family, and then all the families engaged in that. Marnie took it upon herself to ask some questions about, you know, how could this happen and how could we prevent this from happening in the future? And her Two for Seder was born. So I just am so excited to be able to share her story with you. So welcome, Marnie. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Mindy.
Great. So, Marnie, as I have explained to you in our previous phone call, what I do like to do for my listeners is allow you to tell your story and, tell us about October 27th to the extent that you want to share that and give us an opportunity to understand the grief that you and your husband have felt.
No problem. So October 27th, 2018, it feels like a million years ago because of COVID. The healing process has been very different during COVID, which I will certainly get to. But this is all pre-COVID. So if you can remember back in the days before we had all of these COVID issues, my mother-in-law would regularly go to her synagogue every Saturday morning. And the reason that she would go, not only to do regular prayers, but there are certain prayers in the Jewish religion that you need to have 10 people in the room to be able to say them. One of those prayers is called the Kaddish, and that is the prayer that we say when we are mourning our loved ones. So you cannot say that prayer without the community surrounding you. And her synagogue used to be a very, very popular synagogue, but then the demographics changed and people moved out to the suburbs. So her synagogue actually had a hard time getting 10 people together for the first saying of that prayer. You actually say it 3 times on our Sabbath, on Shabbat, Saturday morning. And so she would always get up super early, and she was thinking of other people, and because they did that for her, and she would go and support her community in that way. So when we saw on the TV that there was a shooting in Pittsburgh, and so I live in Washington, D.C. I do not live in Pittsburgh. So when we saw on the TV that there was a shooting in Pittsburgh, and we saw the synagogue that my husband had grew up in, that he had had his bar mitzvah in, that we had prepared for our wedding in, that we had just been in less than a month before for our high holidays called Rosh Hashanah, we knew that Joyce was there, but we didn't know what had happened to her. And we just threw things in the car and we drove, and we actually waited in the Jewish center of Pittsburgh. That's where the community gathered. And they, the FBI was there to protect the families just in case there was another shooter. And it was, I would say, the hardest day of my life, not knowing if Joyce was one of the few people who survived. There were 2 survivors who were in the hospital, we found out later. And we didn't know if she was one of those 2 or if she was one of the people who had been murdered. And I have to tell you, if you'll recall, there was the collapse of the hotel, that building in Florida, where people didn't know if their loved ones were missing or dead or gone, or they had left for the day or whatever. I absolutely know what that kind of waiting feels like. Not knowing what happened to your loved one is almost worse than knowing. It's absolutely horrible. So when we found out, our family wanted to gather around us immediately. In the Jewish faith, we try to bury our dead immediately. It is a sign of respect, but it is also, we cannot start mourning until that person has been buried and basically given back to the earth. So we couldn't do that, though, because this was a very special situation. We wanted to make sure that the police had everything they needed, and it took almost a week before we were able to bury them, which is, I know in the Christian form, in the Christian faith, that is not unusual, but in the Jewish faith, that is, I've never experienced that personally before. So our family said, "Oh, well, we're coming And I said, well, there's no need to come because there's no funeral yet. And they said, you don't know what you need. And we're coming. This happened 2 years ago, and it's still very hard to talk about. So we had hundreds of family members come from all over the United States. Joyce was actually a Canadian citizen as well as an American citizen. So we had a lot of Canadians come. We had French family from Israel, family from Mexico, family from Australia. Everybody came. And then we finally had the funeral, and the funeral was, I barely remember it, but there were thousands of people there. But then we had something called the Shiva, which was after you bury someone, the community takes care of you and your family. And our Shiva, thousands of people came to the Shiva. People, of course, were family, but people from all over Pittsburgh, people of every faith, every creed, every background. They came and they told us this kind of hate is not acceptable. And what can we do? How can we help you? And as this was going along, it was very interesting. So Shiva lasts for 7 days. And as this was going along, people kept saying the same thing. And I realized after a while, they also meant, how can I help myself? Because they were feeling it as if their own family member had been killed. And the idea that by being together, by supporting someone who has just passed away, by supporting the family that's left, it strengthens us all together. And that's when I decided I needed to drop my professional life, and I really needed to give back this love and this support. It was so overwhelming. It was almost more overwhelming than the hate that had spawned it. And it continued. It continued much longer after the 7 days of the Shiva. It continued for months and months and months. I've traveled all over the country talking about what has happened, and so many people believe that hate does not live in this country. Hate needs to be abolished, and that we need to do it together. The question is how. So that's the basics of my story, Mindy.
Wow, Marnie, that was very heartfelt, and your emotion that you had, I could feel it, and I was having my own emotional remembrance of how, as a Christian, we didn't call it a Shiva, but the people came. The family came and the people came, and they lifted us and they surrounded us, and I could feel from my experience when that happened, when we lost my dad and Reet, and of course Terry Lamano lost her life at the same time. So as you were explaining what the Shiva and specifically that time period and those 7 days, but then you said it lasted longer, I know that. I know that feeling, and I really pray that listeners right now, if you are not feeling that and you're in grief, reach out and find your group of people and let your group of people know that you need them. Because as Marnie's saying, it's so uplifting. It was more uplifting. I heard you say this. It was as uplifting and maybe more than the hate that took her life. And I'm so grateful and thankful that you were able to feel that, and then that you're able to articulate it back to us.
I think the interesting thing about the mourning practices that our religions bring us, we kind of need to really look at the psychology behind them. And in the Jewish faith, we have the Shiva, which where people come to us. And then I was talking about the Kaddish and what my mother-in-law was doing at the synagogue, and that takes a whole year. And my husband and actually most of our family, that's exactly what we did. You can't stay in your house and be alone with your grief. It is going to eat you alive. But the community wants to help you. Your friends, your family, they just don't know how. So if you have a tradition where, going to church once a week will allow you to be with your friends, it gives them an opportunity to hold you up. you can't do it by yourself, and you don't need to do it by yourself. They want to help you. And I think I didn't really understand that before, even though I had been through the grieving process before. And it is the love that other people have, and they just don't know how to express it. And by showing up at your church, at your temple, or wherever it is that you know your friends are, it's a safe place, and it's a good time to dedicate to think about the person you lost, but also to let other people be with you in that grief.
Yes, thank you. I tell, and I'll say it to our listeners now, I tell my friends, and I write about this often, we need to give ourselves permission to accept help. And as you mentioned, that can come through a religion, a faith, just understanding in terms of friendship, the support. I think that's very beautiful. And that's an opportunity for us to talk about friendship and the friendships that Joyce had. And so you shared this with me earlier on an earlier conversation that we had, that she had many, many friends, and obviously based on how many people showed up to mourn with you and to celebrate her life. And on the website, you say, "We will never forget." And there's a sentence that says, "Friendship and family ties were the most important thing to Joyce. She was a true woman of valor." Can you speak to Joyce, please, from your perspective, and tell us a little bit more about Joyce?
Absolutely. And Mindy, I want to thank you, because most people just want to hear about how she died and not how she lived. And she was an amazing person. To say in the Jewish faith, to say someone is a woman of valor is one of the highest praises you can give to a female. It is there's a prayer. There's actually a psalm. I'm not sure which number it is, but it's a psalm about a woman of valor. And we actually tried to say it together when we did our prayers during the Shiva. And I have to say, very few people got through it, because it was such a good description of who she was. So the idea that she was a strong woman, but she didn't tell you how you should live your life. She led by example. She really believed that if someone entered her home, that they should be 100% comfortable. So if somebody had an allergy, or they had even a preference, she would twist herself into a pretzel to make sure that all the food was something that they could eat, and it was also delicious, and they were comfortable. And it's very funny. It sounds very simple to do, but it's actually a very complicated thing, especially, I mean, I'm sure many cooks out there have had this experience where you've never had to deal with an allergy before, if it's a new one. Or in addition, we also have kosher rules that different Jews follow them a little bit differently. And it's sometimes a challenge to know exactly how to make your guest feel 100% comfortable. Joyce also believed that everybody was very, very smart, but they were smart in different things. And so what she loved to do was when we had a family meal, or even a group get together of some form, she would get different people from different backgrounds together. And she absolutely felt that the conversation that came about from it would help everybody grow. And this was something that I saw her do for almost 20 years. And she was extremely consistent. She made it look very, very easy. I've tried to replicate it many times. It's actually a little hard to do. But she made being a hostess look effortless. But I knew, because I was brought in to help out, that she prepared for people coming over for hours and hours and hours. She was also a researcher. She actually researched how museums could help you learn better. So how did people learn from a visual perspective, how they learned from a reading perspective, how they interacted with things. She did that for many years, and it really played to her strengths as someone who liked the details, but really cared about others and how they were, not just children, but how adults and how everybody was interacting, and interacting with the actual display that was in front of them. So I think that Joyce, the one last thing I'd like to say about her is that Joyce really dedicated the last, I would say, 15 years of her life to service in the community. She served the community in multiple ways. There was a house, sort of like a Ronald McDonald House, but it was dedicated to the Pittsburgh University's hospital. And she was the person that greeted family members when their family member was a patient, a cancer patient, possibly a very small chance of living, and they needed some place to stay for sometimes weeks, sometimes months. And this was that house. Once again, it's kind of like a Ronald McDonald House. And she dedicated, I think, 15 years of service to that charity. She also helped at the courthouse, the Pittsburgh courthouse, to keep an eye on the kids while the parents were at the court. And it actually was something that I wasn't really aware that she did that second one until after she was killed, because a number of the families that she helped came to the Shiva, and they remembered her, and they were so grateful that somebody was thinking of their children. It's a
Yes.
funny thing to think about, but Joyce was always thinking of things that you would forget, or something that would be important to you but nobody else. And that it just was such a perfect example of that. So bringing people together, caring about people, that's who Joyce was. And I think that keeping that spirit alive is really important.
Well, and you are doing that. You are doing that through Two for Seder. And in just a moment, I'm going to give you a chance to really explain what Two for Seder is, and maybe what it might look like in the coming months. So, and again, I'll put the links into the show notes. So listeners, you will have links to Two for Seder if you get a little bit confused about what we're talking about, because Joyce was Jewish, and Marnie and her husband are Jewish, and Seder is very important to them. And Seder has a lot to do with who Joyce was and how she represented herself. And so, Marnie, can you give us a description, a definition of Seder?
I absolutely can. So, if you are a Christian, you may recognize the Seder as the last meal of the Last Supper of Jesus. And it's actually very important. There's a reason why that was the last meal for Jesus. That is the time when Jews basically take the journey every year from being slaves and just a group of ragtag families in Egypt, and we become a Jewish nation. Every year we take that journey, and Seder means order. And what we do, we actually read from a book that assumes that you have never heard the story of Passover before, and it basically encourages you that you are taking this journey, not my great grandparents, not the great, however many greats it was 3,000 years ago. It wasn't them. It was me, and my children and my parents. We are going out of Egypt together to freedom, to become our own nation. And it is a very interesting holiday because it is not done in the synagogue. It is not done with a rabbi. It is not done with any sort of religious authority. It is done in your home. It is a very, very intimate sort of a situation, because it is a place where my parents and my children and my nieces and my sister, and they're all going to be there together. It is absolutely an integral event. And it's very interesting because there was a poll done many times. Actually, they do this like once every 10 years. The federations do this. And it is, what is the holiday that people do, even if they don't go to synagogue, even if they're unaffiliated? And Passover is the holiday, even more than Hanukkah, which you may have heard of. Passover is the one holiday that almost every single Jew feels that they need to participate in it one time of the year. We're coming up on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Those are the second most important. The most important is the Seder. And one thing I love about it is that, you go to different friends' Seders or different parts of the family, and little things are done differently. People really have their own home traditions about how to interpret this activity. The core is always the same. That never changes. And it's very comforting to know that what the Seder that I'm doing is the same Seder that was done 2,000 years ago. There are very few changes in the texts from that. But there's still little things that we do to make it our own, that our children can do to bring it to life for them. Stories that our parents will tell about, when they were children. And it's so personal and so intimate. And the Seder is a very, very special time for Jews.
And yes, so very personal and unique, but yet, so unique to the home is what I heard, but yet the same story. So the most important story is told, and then each family gets to tell it, which I think is great. And I had to chuckle to myself when you were talking about the federations taking a poll and asking, what high holiday is the highest holiday, type of thing. And in Christianity, we call those people people who go to Christmas and Easter. They're Christmas and Easter Christians,
Right.
and so those are the two. And I'm not sure which one might be the highest. Maybe Christmas Eve service. I'm wondering if Christmas Eve service might be. I'm not sure, but I appreciate all the detail that you are offering to us about Seder and the importance of it. And I do appreciate you also mentioning, Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, because those, the podcast that we're talking about now, we're dropping this podcast in September, and these, holidays are coming up, and they are important in the Jewish faith. But what you focused on after Joyce's murder was Seder, and specifically because of the coming together and the uniqueness and the being in the home. And I love how that really ties into who Joyce was. If you would, well, let me say this to our listeners. Let me tell you all what you need to know about Marnie. And Marnie commented, and you can elaborate on this a little bit for us too, that you left your employment to focus on this. So Marnie's past experience includes working with the Department of Homeland Security and working with NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Yes, that NASA. And she felt so, compelled and touched by what happened, and then how she was embraced by community with so much love, to leave her employment and take on the social action and social justice, fighting against anti-Semitism. And that is where then the Two for Seder was created. And then correct me, Marnie, on any of that I might be wrong on.
No, that's exactly right. I think it's very difficult to explain the power of anti-Semitism to someone who isn't Jewish. I know you can understand it intellectually. And I think before October 27th, I understood it, not just intellectually. There was some emotional behind it, but it seemed to be in the past. And I think this is an important thing that I want to get across to your listeners, that for American Jews especially, we are very blessed to be in America, like we all are. But I think the idea that, the anti-Semitism that has been happening in Europe for the past 20 years, my brother-in-law who lives in Paris, he has been assaulted a number of times for wearing his yarmulke. There have been many, many attacks on different, different families all over Europe. It still felt like it was over there. So it felt the Holocaust is very personal to everyone, but it also felt like it was in the past. So we felt like we were in this bubble of no anti-Semitism, that maybe America had moved beyond this kind of hate, and maybe we could focus on fixing the world with all the other kinds of hate that there were. And then actually what happened to you really was the beginning of that change, where American Jews started waking up to saying, this is not the case. You're in a dream. You need to wake up. And then, of course, there was an event in 2016 that happened not too far from me in Virginia, that there were some neo-Nazis that were protesting, and there was someone that was killed there. And that was another wake-up call. And the idea that every synagogue in America has a security guard outside of it, the idea that my child doesn't think twice, she says hello. And she has no idea that the church down the street does not have a security guard. When we go into our Jewish centers today, there is very, very, very high security, like the kind that you would get when you go onto an airplane. It's very similar security. I don't think that, 5-10 years ago, that there was any idea that this would be happening. And it really, when it happened to me, when it happened so close to home, when it happened to someone like Joyce, I just couldn't not do anything. So I think that anti-Semitism is something that if you have a Jewish friend, they are hyper aware of it. Just like if you have an African-American friend, they are hyper aware of racism that if you are not African-American, you may not be aware of. So it is definitely something that the question is to me, how do you bridge that gap? How do you you don't want to have a lecture. You don't want to be wagging your finger at someone. What can I do to encourage someone to understand Judaism a little bit more from a happy place? Because Judaism is not something that makes me sad or unhappy. It's a place of strength for me. And it's a core part of my identity and most American Jews' identity. How can I share the joy, not the sadness? And that's the core of Two for Seder.
Oh, I love that, Marnie. How can we share the joy and not the sadness? That's beautiful. Friends, I want you to know that that first there's going to be Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, and then there will be Seder during Passover. And you will find the links to all of these and a little bit more explanation to each of them. What I would love for you to do as a listener is pay attention to what Marnie's message has been and what Joyce's message in life was before her life was taken, is that we are to welcome our neighbor. We are to be friends of one another and care for one another. Thank you so much for joining me today, Marnie.
Thank you so much for having me, Mindy.
Wonderful. So friends, have a great day and go out and think of your neighbor. Friends, thanks so much for joining me today for this podcast of Real Grief, Real Healing with Mindy Corporan. If you want to dive deeper into how you might heal yourself or a friend, please pick up a copy of my book, Healing a Shattered Soul. Published on May 3rd, 2021, You can find my memoir anywhere books are sold. You will also find me in social media channels as Mindy Corporan. Take time to help yourself heal, accepting courageous kindness. Take time to heal another by giving courageous kindness. Together, we are better.
Real Grief, Real Healing is copyright 2021 to 2022, Mindy Corporan, all rights reserved. Our theme music is composed by Dave Croft and used with permission. This podcast is a production of 818 Studios.